The sun was just beginning to set over the Hollywood hills, painting the sky in deep shades of purple and burning gold. It was the kind of evening that feels electric, like the air itself is charged with anticipation. High up in the exclusive residential area, a massive mansion was glowing with light. This wasn't just a regular house party. It was a gathering of the most powerful people in the entertainment and tech industries. The guest list was strictly guarded, and the security was tighter than a bank vault. Everyone inside had a reason to be there, but tonight, all eyes were secretly on one man who was about to arrive. The cars parked in the driveway told a story of extreme wealth. There were sleek black limousines, rare Italian sports cars, and a few SUVs that looked like tanks. The people stepping out of these vehicles were dressed in designer suits and gowns that cost more than most people make in a year. They were laughing, drinking champagne, and talking loudly about stocks, movies, and vacations to private islands. The atmosphere was loud, flashy, and full of ego. It was the kind of place where everyone wanted to be seen, and everyone wanted to prove they were the most important person in the room. But amidst all this noise and showboating, the man of the hour was arriving in a very different way. Keanu Reeves pulled up to the entrance in a vintage Porsche. It was a beautiful car, sure, but it wasn't a flashy supercar. It didn't scream for attention. He stepped out wearing a simple, dark suit. No giant diamond watch, no chains, no entourage of bodyguards pushing people out of the way. He looked like a gentleman who was comfortable in his own skin. He walked up to the security guard at the gate and offered a warm smile, shaking the man's hand before asking how his night was going. The security guard, used to being treated like furniture by the rich guests, beamed with surprise and respect. Keanu was there for business, not just pleasure. There was a rumor floating around the industry that a massive deal was about to be signed. It was reported to be worth nearly $750 million. His production company was planning a huge merger with a leading technology conglomerate. This wasn't just about money. It was about changing how movies are made and watched. Keanu had been working on this project for years, putting his heart and soul into it. He was the creative force, the one with the vision, and the tech giants were providing the money and the tools. Tonight was supposed to be the final celebration before the papers were signed tomorrow morning. It was a night that should have been full of happiness and excitement. As Keanu walked into the main hall of the mansion, the vibe shifted slightly. People noticed him. But Keanu didn't walk in like he owned the place. He moved with a quiet calm. He stopped to talk to a waiter carrying a tray of drinks, asking him if he had taken a break yet. He waved at a janitor cleaning a spill. This was Keanu's way. Despite being one of the most famous actors in the world, he never lost his humanity. In a room full of sharks, he felt like a dolphin, friendly and out of place, but respected by everyone who knew him. However, not everyone in the room admired this humble attitude. In the far corner of the room, near a massive ice sculpture, stood the heir to the tech empire. We'll call him Julian. Julian was young, maybe in his late 20s, and he had everything handed to him on a silver platter. He had never struggled a day in his life. He was dressed in a suit that was likely tailored in Milan, holding a glass of the most expensive champagne available. He had a group of people around him, laughing at his jokes, even though they weren't funny. Julian was loud. He gestured wildly, his voice cutting through the background music. He loved the sound of his own voice. He loved power. Julian was the reason the $750 million deal was possible. But he didn't care about the art. He didn't care about Keanu's vision. He only cared that his name would be on the news as the genius behind the merger. He was the exact opposite of Keanu. While Keanu respected everyone, Julian respected no one. He treated the staff like dirt, snapping his fingers at them to refill his glass, and making fun of guests who weren't on his level. As Keanu made his way through the crowd, shaking hands and offering soft-spoken greetings, Julian's eyes locked onto him. Julian narrowed his eyes, swirling his champagne. He didn't see a legend. He didn't see a brilliant businessman. He saw a man in a modest suit who didn't seem to fit in with the elite crowd that Julian imagined he ruled. To Julian, kindness looked like weakness. Humility looked like poverty. He leaned over to one of his friends and whispered something cruel, pointing at Keanu. The friend laughed, though he looked uncomfortable. The room was split into two worlds. On one side, there was Keanu, standing with a group of writers, listening intently to what they were saying, nodding, smiling, looking completely at ease. On the other side was Julian, holding court, demanding attention, looking for a reason to prove he was the alpha in the room. The air between them began to feel heavy, like the calm before a storm. Everyone knew that these two men had to meet eventually. The deal depended on it. But nobody expected what was about to happen next. Julian, feeling a buzz from the alcohol and a surge of arrogance, decided he wasn't going to wait for a formal introduction. He wanted to test the movie star. He wanted to see if the nice guy persona was real or if Keanu would break under pressure. He excused himself from his group, grabbing a fresh bottle of champagne from a passing tray. He started walking across the marble floor, directly toward Keanu. The music seemed to fade as the distance between them closed. The rich kid was on the move, and the night was about to take a very ugly turn. The celebration of a lifetime was just minutes away from turning into a disaster that would cost the company billions. Keanu, unaware of the storm heading his way, simply took a sip of water and waited for the evening to progress. The music in the grand hall seemed to dip just a little as Julian began his march across the room. It wasn't that the volume actually changed, but the energy shifted. People have a way of sensing trouble before it happens. It's like a primal instinct, a feeling in the gut that tells you to look away or step back. As Julian moved through the crowd, guests parted like the Red Sea. They knew his temper, and they didn't want to be collateral damage. He held that expensive bottle of champagne by the neck, swinging it slightly as he walked, not like a waiter, but like a king holding a scepter. His eyes were fixed on Keanu. There was a mean-spirited glint in them that made anyone watching feel nervous. Keanu was still standing near the tall windows, talking to a young scriptwriter and an older cinematographer. He was listening intently, nodding his head, completely focused on the story they were telling him. He laughed at something the cinematographer said, a genuine, warm laugh that crinkled the corners of his eyes. In that moment, he looked like a regular guy enjoying a conversation, not a megastar worth millions. But that was exactly what bothered Julian. To Julian, power was about noise, about intimidation, and about making people bow. Seeing Keanu stand there, calm and unbothered, felt like a challenge to Julian's authority. When Julian finally reached the group, he didn't say "excuse me" or politely tap Keanu on the shoulder. He just inserted himself right into the circle, physically bumping the scriptwriter aside with his shoulder. The writer stumbled a bit, looking startled, but quickly lowered her head and stepped back. She knew who Julian was. She knew that crossing him meant losing her job. Julian ignored her completely. He stood chest to chest with Keanu, invading his personal space, smelling of expensive cologne and arrogance. "So," Julian said, his voice loud enough for the people nearby to hear, "You're the guy my dad is handing all this money to?" He didn't extend a hand to shake. He just stood there, a sneer playing on his lips, looking Keanu up and down like he was inspecting a used car. Keanu paused for a second, taking in the sudden hostility. He didn't flinch or step back. He just turned his body to face Julian, keeping his hands loosely at his sides. He offered a polite, tentative smile, trying to diffuse the tension before it started. "Yes, I guess I am," Keanu replied softly. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I've heard a lot about your family's work in the tech industry. We're very excited about the partnership." The words were professional and kind, exactly what you would expect at a business gala. But Julian didn't want politeness. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to see Keanu get nervous or angry. He hated that Keanu was treating him like a business colleague instead of a superior being. Julian let out a short, mocking laugh. "Excited?" "You should be," Julian shot back, gesturing around the room with the champagne bottle. "We're basically saving your little movie studio. Without us, you'd probably be, I don't know, doing independent films for pocket change." He took a step closer, enjoying the moment. "My dad says you're a visionary. I don't see it. I just see a guy who pretends to fight for a living." A few people nearby stopped talking. The conversation died down as the awkwardness spread. It was a rude comment, unprovoked and unnecessary. The cinematographer, who had been standing with Keanu, looked at Julian with wide eyes, terrified that things were escalating. But Keanu didn't take the bait. He didn't defend his acting career or his studio. He simply stood there, absorbing the insults with a quiet dignity that somehow made Julian look even smaller. "Everyone has their own perspective," Keanu said calmly. His voice was steady. He wasn't going to let this drunk young man ruin the deal. He knew how much was at stake, not just for him, but for the hundreds of people who worked for his company. He was willing to be the punching bag if it meant keeping the $750 million deal alive. "I think this partnership is going to create something really special. Something that helps a lot of storytellers." Julian's face darkened. He was expecting Keanu to fight back. He was looking for an excuse to get loud, to shout him down, to prove to the room that the movie star was a fraud. But Keanu's calmness was infuriating. It was like punching a cloud. The harder Julian tried to land a hit, the more Keanu just let it pass through him. Julian felt his face getting hot. He looked around and saw people watching. He felt like they were judging him, thinking that he couldn't handle this action hero. Julian took a swig of champagne straight from the bottle, which was a major breach of etiquette at such a high-class event. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and narrowed his eyes. "You know, you dress like you're broke," Julian sneered, looking at Keanu's simple suit. "My dad said this was a black tie event. Did you not get the memo? Or do you just not care about respecting the people paying your bills?" "I like this suit," Keanu said simply. There was no defensiveness in his tone, just a statement of fact. "I feel comfortable in it." "Comfortable," Julian repeated the word, dragging it out like it was a joke. "That's cute. You know, in the real world, the business world, we don't pay for comfortable. We pay for power. We pay for dominance." He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a harsh whisper. But Keanu could still hear him clearly. "And you look like a waiter. I almost tipped you when you walked in." The air around them felt heavy now. The insult was hanging there, ugly and sharp. The group of writers and technicians had scattered, leaving Keanu isolated. He was standing alone against a bully who had everything: money, power, and the protection of his family name. Keanu looked at Julian. He didn't look angry. He looked at him with a kind of sad curiosity. It was the look you give a child throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. He saw right through Julian. He saw the insecurity, the desperate need for validation. Keanu decided he had tried enough. He wasn't going to stand here and be abused for the sake of a contract. He slowly shifted his weight, preparing to excuse himself from the conversation. "Well, Julian," Keanu said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its warmth, "I think I've heard enough of your thoughts for tonight. I'm going to go get some air." He turned to leave. It was a dismissal. A calm, cool dismissal. And that was the breaking point for Julian. He had pushed, and Keanu hadn't fallen. He had insulted, and Keanu hadn't cried. But now that Keanu was trying to walk away, Julian felt his control slipping. He couldn't let the movie star have the last word. He couldn't let him just walk out of this ring with his dignity intact. Julian's hand tightened around the neck of the champagne bottle, his knuckles turning white. "Don't you turn your back on me," Julian snapped, his voice rising. "I'm talking to you." The alcohol in his system was mixing with his ego, creating a dangerous cocktail. He wasn't thinking about the $750 million deal anymore. He wasn't thinking about his father's company. He was only thinking about the humiliation of being ignored. He looked around for a way to stop Keanu, a way to drag him back down to the mud where Julian thought he belonged. His eyes landed on a waiter passing by with a tray of fresh, bubbling glasses. A terrible idea formed in his mind, one that would cross the line from rude to unforgivable in a split second. Keanu had barely taken 2 steps toward the exit when Julian sprang into action. It wasn't a graceful movement. It was clumsy and aggressive, driven by too much alcohol and a massive ego. Julian lunged forward, not to attack Keanu with his fists, but to intercept a young waiter who was walking by with a heavy silver tray stacked high with champagne flutes. The waiter, a young guy just trying to do his job, didn't see Julian coming. Julian bumped into the waiter hard, causing the tray to tilt dangerously. But instead of apologizing or helping the waiter steady the drinks, Julian used the collision as a weapon. With a loud, exaggerated whoops, Julian grabbed two of the full champagne flutes off the tray, spun around to face Keanu's back. In that split second, time seemed to slow down for everyone watching. They saw what was about to happen, but they were paralyzed by the sheer shock of it. Julian lifted his hands and stumbled forward, making it look like a trip, but the aim was perfect. He didn't just spill the drinks, he thrust them outward. The golden liquid exploded from the glasses. The ice-cold champagne hit Keanu squarely, in the chest, and splashed upward, soaking his white shirt, his tie, and even hitting his face and hair. It was a direct hit. The bubbly wine drenched him instantly, running down his jacket and dripping onto the polished floor. The sound of the liquid splashing seemed to echo through the suddenly silent hall. It was a violation of personal space, a calculated move to humiliate a man in front of his peers. For a moment, nobody moved. The waiter stood frozen, his eyes wide with horror, terrified he was going to be fired. The musicians in the corner stopped playing, the melody trailing off into an awkward silence. The CEO of the tech company, who had been chatting across the room, turned to see what the commotion was, his jaw dropping as he took in the scene. There stood Keanu Reeves, one of the most respected actors in Hollywood, dripping wet with expensive champagne. And standing in front of him was Julian, holding the empty glasses, his chest heaving slightly. A wild look in his eyes. Then came the laughter. Julian let out a harsh, barking laugh that cut through the tension like a knife. He looked at his friends, expecting them to join in, and a few of them let out nervous chuckles, though their faces were pale. Julian looked back at Keanu, sneering with satisfaction. He had finally gotten the reaction he wanted. He had dirtied the nice guy. He had brought the star down to his level. My bad. Julian shouted, though he didn't sound sorry at all. His voice dripped with sarcasm. I totally tripped. Should really watch where you're standing, man. You're kind of in the way. He took a step closer, invading Keanu's space again, enjoying the fact that Keanu was wet and uncomfortable. He looked down at Keanu's soaked shirt and shook his head. Actually looking at you now? I thought you were part of the cleanup crew with that outfit. I was just trying to give you a tip, but it looks like I missed the glass. The insult was cruel and specific. It was designed to cut deep, attacking Keanu's dignity and his choice to dress modestly. Julian's friends laughed a little louder this time, trying to please the boss's son. A few other guests, however, turned away in disgust. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. It was a display of pure, unadulterated bullying. It was the kind of behavior you expect from a mean teenager in a school cafeteria, not from a grown man at a business gala involving nearly $1 billion. Keanu stood perfectly still. The champagne was cold, making his skin feel sticky and chilled. He could feel the liquid running down his neck and soaking into his undershirt. It was uncomfortable. Yes. It was embarrassing. Absolutely. But Keanu didn't wipe his face. He didn't rush to find a napkin. He didn't yell at Julian or push him away. Just stood there, letting the silence stretch out. Slowly, Keanu raised his hands and looked at the wet sleeves of his jacket. He seemed to be assessing the damage with a strange calmness. Then he lifted his head and locked eyes with Julian. The look in Keanu's eyes wasn't angry. It was worse than anger. It was a look of profound disappointment. It was the look a father gives a son who has just done something terrible and unforgivable. It was a look that said, I see exactly who you are, and I feel sorry for you. Julian's smile faltered for a second. He had expected shouting. He had expected Keanu to get mad, maybe curse at him or even swing a punch. If Keanu had fought back, Julian could have played the victim, claiming the movie star had a temper. But Keanu's silence was unnerving. It stripped away Julian's power. The wetter Keanu got, the more dignified he seemed, while Julian, dry and holding his empty glasses, looked like a petty child. You think this is funny? Keanu asked quietly. His voice wasn't loud, but in the silent room, everyone could hear him clearly. Julian tried to regain his composure, puffing out his chest. Lighten up, buddy. It's just a drink. It's a party. Stop acting so serious. He waved his hand dismissively, splashing a few more drops of champagne onto the floor. You people take yourselves too seriously. It's just champagne. Keanu looked down at the puddle forming at his feet. He watched a drop of wine fall from his chin. He took a slow, deep breath. It's not about the drink, Julian, Keanu said softly. It's about respect. It's about how you treat people. You didn't do this because you tripped. You did this because you wanted to feel big. You wanted to humiliate me in front of these people, to prove something to yourself. I don't have to prove anything to you, Julian snapped, his voice rising. He was feeling defensive now because the crowd wasn't laughing with him anymore. They were staring at him with judgment. The CEO was making his way across the room, looking furious. Julian could feel the control of the room slipping away from him. You're just an actor. He spat out the words like they were poison. You pretend to be a hero. God. But in real life, you're just a guy in a wet shirt who can't take a joke. The room was deadly silent now. The tension was so thick it felt hard to breathe. This was the moment. This was the turning point. Everyone was waiting to see what Keanu would do. Would he walk away? Would he yell? Keanu reached into his jacket pocket, ignoring the sticky mess, and pulled out a clean white handkerchief. He unfolded it slowly, deliberately.
No.
He brought it up to his face and dabbed the champagne from his eyes and forehead. He wiped his cheeks with slow, precise movements. When he lowered the handkerchief, his face was clean, but his eyes were harder than steel. The nice guy mask was gone. The patience had run out. Keanu Reeves was done being bullied. He looked past Julian, scanning the room until he found the CEO, who was just a few feet away, fuming. Keanu didn't look at Julian again. He didn't offer a parting shot or a witty comeback. He simply stepped around Julian, careful not to touch him. As if the younger man was something toxic, he didn't want to get on his shoes. Keanu began to walk toward the exit, leaving a trail of wet footprints on the marble floor. Julian stood there with his mouth open, holding the empty glasses. He had won the battle, he had soaked the guide, but he was quickly realizing he was about to lose the war. The party was over. The deal was hanging by a thread, and it was all because of his own arrogance. The rich kid had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and he didn't even know it yet. The silence that followed Keanu as he walked away from Julian was heavy and suffocating. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind that happens right after a car crash, where everyone is holding their breath, waiting to see who is hurt. Julian stood frozen near the windows, his grip tight on the empty champagne glasses. His smirk was fading, replaced by a dawning realization that the room wasn't impressed. The wealthy guests, the investors, the actors, they were all looking at him with a mix of pity and disgust. He tried to laugh again, a dry, nervous chuckle, but it died in his throat. No one laughed with him. Keanu didn't run. He didn't rush to the exit to escape the humiliation. He walked with a steady, deliberate pace, leaving wet footprints on the expensive marble floor. He was heading straight for the CEO of the tech company, the man who had organized this entire event. The CEO, an older man with gray hair and a stern face, was standing near the grand staircase. He had seen everything. His face was bright red, a mixture of anger and sheer panic. He knew exactly what was at stake. He knew that his son had just lit a fuse under $750 million Australian dollars deal. As Keanu approached, the crowd parted for him like he was royalty. They stepped back, not wanting to get in his way, but also out of respect. He looked like a mess soaked in champagne, hair plastered to his forehead, but he carried himself with more dignity than anyone else in the room. He stopped in front of the CEO. The music had completely stopped now. Every pair of eyes in the hall was locked on this conversation. Sir Keanu said. His voice was calm, remarkably so. It wasn't shaky or emotional. It was the voice of a man who had made a difficult decision and was at peace with it. The CEO swallowed hard. He looked at Keanu's soaked shirt, then over his shoulder at his son, Julian, who was still standing by the window looking confused. The CEO held up his hands, his palms sweating. Keanu, I am so sorry, he stammered. I don't know what got into him. He's had too much to drink. He didn't mean it. Please, let me get you a towel. We can go to the back, get you cleaned up, and we can forget this ever happened. It was a desperate offer. The CEO was trying to smooth things over with money and excuses. He was hoping that Keanu would just be a good sport and let it slide for the sake of the business deal. It's what most people would have done. $750 million is a life-changing amount of money. It's enough to make anyone swallow their pride and walk away from an insult. But Keanu didn't move. He stood there, dripping, and looked the CEO directly in the eyes. "It's not about the shirt, and it's not about the champagne," Keanu said softly. He didn't shout, but his voice carried authority. "I can buy a new shirt. I can wash my hair. That's not the problem." The CEO blinked, nervous. "Then, what is the problem?" "We can discipline him. I'll talk to him right now. He will apologize to you publicly, I swear." Keanu shook his head slowly. "This isn't just a mistake. It's character," he said. "I spent the last year working on this partnership because I believed in what we were building. I thought we shared the same values. I thought we wanted to create something honest." He paused, glancing around the room at the shocked faces. "But if the heir to this company thinks it's acceptable to treat another human being like that, to degrade them, to humiliate them for fun, then I can't be part of it." Julian seemed to realize that things were going wrong. He stomped his foot on the floor, the sound echoing through the room. "Oh, come on!" Julian yelled, his voice slurred. "Are you serious right now? You're leaving because of a little spill? Dad, tell him to stop being such a baby. It's a joke." The room gasped. Someone actually whispered, "Shut up," but Julian didn't hear it. He was too fueled by his own ego to see the cliff he was running toward. He started walking toward them. "You think you're better than me?" Julian shouted. "You're just an actor. I run this city. You can't walk away from us. You need this deal more than we need you." The CEO closed his eyes in agony. His son was digging the hole deeper and deeper. He turned around and hissed at Julian. "Be quiet, Julian. For once in your life, shut your mouth." But it was too late. The damage was done. Keanu watched Julian's outburst without blinking. He saw the rage in the young man's eyes, the entitlement that poisoned his soul. Keanu turned back to the CEO. "You see," Keanu asked quietly, "he doesn't even understand what he did wrong. And until he does, or until he is no longer the face of your future, I cannot in good conscience sign those papers." The CEO looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. He looked at Keanu, standing there wet and dignified, and then at his son, red-faced and screaming. He realized he had to make a choice. He could side with his son and keep his pride, but he would lose the biggest deal in his company's history. Or he could take a stand. Keanu didn't wait for the answer. He reached out and patted the CEO gently on the shoulder. It was a kind gesture, a gesture of finality. "I value my peace of mind more than money," Keanu said, "and I value the people I work with. I can't have my partners treating people like trash. It's just not who I am." He took a step back. The silence was absolute now. You could hear the ice melting in the buckets. "So," Keanu concluded, his voice final, "I'm going to go home, dry off, and find a partner who respects me. The deal is off." He didn't say it angrily. He didn't slam his fist on the table. He said it with the simple certainty of someone stating that the sky is blue. It was a fact. The $750 million was gone. Just like that, the CEO stood there, stunned. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He watched as Keanu turned his back on him. Keanu didn't look at Julian. He didn't look at the guests. He simply adjusted his wet jacket and began to walk toward the front doors. The power in the room had completely shifted. Julian was no longer the king of the castle. He was the jester who had burned it down. And Keanu, the humble man in the wet suit, was the only one left standing with his honor intact. The consequences were about to rain down, and everyone knew it was going to be a storm. As Keanu walked out of the grand double doors and into the cool night air, it felt like he was leaving a completely different world than the one he had entered just an hour ago. Inside, the air had been stuffy with expensive perfume and arrogance. Outside, the air was fresh and clean. The valet attendants were waiting, looking nervous. They had heard the shouting from inside. One of them quickly brought Keanu's vintage Porsche around. He saw the wet shirt and the champagne in Keanu's hair, but he didn't say a word. He just opened the door respectfully. Keanu reached into his damp pocket, pulled out a $100 bill, and handed it to the young valet. "For the trouble," he said softly. Then he got into his car. He didn't spin the tires or speed away in anger. He just drove off into the night, quiet and calm, leaving the chaos behind him. But back inside the mansion, the chaos was just beginning. The silence that Keanu left behind didn't last long. It shattered the moment the heavy front doors clicked shut. The CEO, a man who usually commanded respect with a mere whisper, exploded. He didn't look at his guests or his business partners. He turned the full force of his rage onto his son, Julian. The look in the CEO's eyes was terrifying. It wasn't just anger. It was the cold, hard realization that his own flesh and blood had just destroyed his life's work. "You idiot!" The CEO roared, his voice shaking the chandeliers overhead. He stepped closer to Julian, getting right in his face. It was the opposite of the polite distance Keanu had kept. "Do you have any idea what you just did? Do you understand that you just cost us $750 million? Julian flinched. The alcohol was still clouding his brain, but the sheer volume of his father's voice was cutting through the fog. He looked around the room. The guests weren't looking at him with envy anymore. They were looking at him with pity and contempt. He tried to laugh it off again, but his voice came out weak and shaky. "Dad, come on," he stammered. He was leaving anyway. "He's a drama queen. We can find another actor. There are plenty of them. This isn't about an actor." The CEO screamed, losing his composure completely. "This is about reputation. This is about respect. Keanu Reeves isn't just some actor we hired. He is the soul of this project. The investors were there because of him. The technology was there because of his vision. Without him, we don't have a deal. We have nothing." The CEO turned to his head of security, a large man standing by the wall. "Get him out of here," the CEO ordered, pointing a shaking finger at his own son. Julian's mouth fell open. "What? Dad, you can't be serious. This is my house. Well, our house. You're kicking me out?" I said, "Get him out." The CEO repeated. "Take him to his apartment downtown and make sure he doesn't come back here until he learns how to be a human being. You are officially off the board of directors. You are done here." The security guards stepped forward. They didn't grab Julian roughly, but they were firm. They took him by the arms. For the first time in his life, Julian couldn't buy his way out of a situation. He couldn't call his lawyer. He couldn't threaten to cut off their paychecks. His own father had stripped him of his power. He was dragged toward the door, struggling and shouting, his face turning bright red with humiliation. The very humiliation he had tried to inflict on Keanu was now his own constant companion as the front doors opened again to throw Julian out. The rest of the guests stood in awkward clusters. The party was effectively over. The mood was dead. The magic of the $750 million merger had evaporated. People started grabbing their coats and heading for the exits, whispering among themselves. They weren't talking about the deal anymore. They were talking about the rich kid who threw it all away because he couldn't control his ego. By the next morning, the news had spread like wildfire. It wasn't just a rumor in the Hollywood Hills. It was headlines all over the world. Keanu Reeves walks away from massive $750 million deal. Humiliation at gala leads to business collapse. The newspapers and online sites didn't praise Julian. They didn't say he was cool or dominant. They painted him as a villain. He became a laughingstock. Memes flooded the internet, showing Julian spilling the drink with captions about how to lose billions in 1 second. The tech company's stock took a hit immediately. It wasn't just the money they lost from the Keanu deal. It was the trust. Investors were scared. If the company was run by a family that acted like that, nobody wanted to give them their money. The CEO issued a public apology, but the damage was done. He had to step back from many of his own projects to try and clean up the mess his son had made. It was going to take years, maybe decades, to rebuild the reputation that Julian had destroyed in 5 minutes of drunken stupidity. And what about Keanu? The next afternoon, Keanu was seen at a small diner in Los Angeles. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans. He sat in a corner booth, drinking a coffee and reading a book. He didn't look stressed. He didn't look like a man who had just walked away from $750 million. When a waiter recognized him and asked if he was okay, Keanu just smiled that familiar, humble smile. "I'm doing great," he said. "Just enjoying my day." He proved a lesson that day that money can't buy. Julian had the money, the fancy suit, and the champagne, but he was empty inside. He was insecure and weak, despite his bank account. Keanu had a quiet strength that came from knowing who he was. He understood that no amount of money is worth your dignity. He knew that sometimes. It's the most powerful thing you can do is simply walk away and refuse to let people treat you like garbage. The deal was dead. The partnership was over. But in the court of public opinion, Keanu Reeves was the winner. He kept his soul, his pride, and the respect of everyone who heard the story. And as for Julian, he was just another rich kid who learned the hard way that you can't humiliate a good man without destroying yourself in the process. The champagne had washed away the dirt from Keanu's jacket, but the stain on Julian's reputation would never come out.